Hello, class. Today I'm going to give you guys a lecture on Chapter 5, Part 1. I'll probably save Part 2 for Wednesday or Thursday. That way I don't give away the answers on your quiz. So let's get started here. All right, so your quiz, you're going to be doing that inside of the discussions. It's really more of a discussion, but I want you guys to pick 3 of these 5 generals. And then you're going to discuss 2 to 3 details per each one of them on how they contributed to the fall of the Republic. Of course, they're not the only people. They're just some of the most important people involved in this fall. So we'll get into that in Part 2. So here we go. Before we get to Rome, we got to talk about the Italian Peninsula in this early period, coming out of the dark ages of the ancient period. Just like all other places, they would have been affected by the sea peoples. And so there has to be, civilization has to come back, if you will. Reading and writing has to come back. So there's going to be a time period where there's a lot of, we don't have written records for this time period. We have to use anthropology, archaeology. And we're talking here about the Etruscans. These were the main people involved in control of at least the middle to the northern Italian peninsula. And this is at the same time that the Romans will be establishing themselves in a few cities. The thing we have to remember about Romans, these Latin speakers, these are just 1 or 2 tribes amongst many, many others, and they're the only ones using this language, Latin. So the significance about that is you think about all the people that speak Latin today, and all the people have Latin cultures. And what I mean by that, I mean Italians, Romanians, French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, so on and so forth. That's how far-reaching this Latin language, this Latin culture will go. So that's very important. So these, this group here, the Latins, will create this group or league called the Latin Rite. And as they go conquering their neighbors or just marrying into them and bringing them in, you're allowed to join their culture, their society. This is what it is, the Latin Rite. The Romans are going to be very open, if you will, to bringing new people in. They're not going to guard jealously as much their citizenship as, say, the Greek city-states would have. All right. So, of course, we go from kingdom to republic. You have like 5 or 7 kings. Some of these kings are kind of mythical, so we're not sure if all of them were real or not. But anyways, you get to the last of the kings and or their son, and they overreach, they overstep their control, and one of them rapes a noble Roman woman, and they have a rebellion, a revolution over this, and this is how the Republic is born. So this is the rape of Lucretia here, and she's a cousin of Lucius Junius Brutus. This is not the Brutus that kills Caesar, but of the same ancient family. So this happens in 509 BC. The Roman Republic is founded. So hopefully you got, some of you guys in the discussions would have written what a republic is, maybe how different a republic is versus, say, a democracy. That's very important, because a republic, res publica, means the people's business, okay? And the people's thing. They control the government and they're part of the government. It's not a pure democracy, but there is democracy involved in the Roman Republic. They have voting assemblies and a Senate. I'll get into that later on their levels of democracy, but it is a republic. It's a representative republic. So you do have all young men at one point voting in Rome, but they're voting to send representatives that are then going to go vote on the rules. They don't get to go in and vote on the rules directly as they would in ancient Greece in many of the city-states. And this is important because the United States is a republic. The forefathers did research the Greeks and the Romans. And of course, under the Articles of Confederation, they went more with a Greek-style league, a loosely bound confederacy, and that fell apart very quickly. It didn't really work well. And so they decided when they wrote up the Constitution that they were going to go with the Republic, because the Roman Republic lasts from 509 BC to about 30 BC. And then even the empire, which is going to last almost another 1,000 years, plus if you count the Eastern Empire, There are elements of republic even in the empire for the entire time. So the forefathers would have looked and said, that seems like a pretty stable form of government. This is just a nice painting made during the French Revolution, so you got to take that within the context too. But this is about Lucius Junius Brutus coming to power. He's one of the first consuls of the Republic. One of the things he has to do is give orders to kill his own sons. His own sons, through the mother, are related to the last kings, some of the last kings of Rome. So this is a royal family, and then moving into non-royalty here, because republics don't have kings. So this kind of shows how hardcore the Roman state was. That sometimes you might have to kill your own family. This is an extreme, obviously, but you will notice this with Roman fathers having this power over their children. Technically speaking, they don't have to exercise it very often, but Roman fathers did have power over life and death of their own children. So the government, early government. We've got censors. These men might come about later, but censors are given a position after they've served as a consul, and every 5 years or so, these men are going to be elected, and they're going to hold the position for a few years, and they're going to take the census, basically, but they're going to make sure that everyone in the Senate and everyone in the lower assemblies basically are following the rules, moral rules and other rules, making sure that they're meeting the qualifications for land and money. If not, they could strike people out of the Senate, make sure that everyone's qualified to be there. You've got the consul. There'll be 2 consuls, of course. In times of emergency, you can have a dictator. This is an elected position, but for emergency only. You're only allowed 6 months to be the dictator. Some of these rules and regulations I'm going to be giving you, as far as term limits and whatnot, you should pay attention, because that is going to be some of the rules that those generals are going to break towards the end of the republic. They learn that they can game the system, if you will, and that takes a few centuries for people to figure that out. And then the fix is in, and the system's going to collapse. But there's many rules as far as term limits, and I'll get into that in just a second here. So yeah, dictator, that was an elected position, but for 6 months only. You've got the Senate. That comes from the word senex, which means old man, and you did have to be a certain age, and I'll get to that later. And then you have lower assemblies. Sometimes there's 2 of these, sometimes there's 1 of them. Oftentimes it's to be the centurionate assembly, so 1 out of 100 men in your town or whatnot would be elected to go there. And these men would also impart the command on some of these upper men in battle, okay? Also, the men that would be elected into the centurion assembly would be your centurion in battle. So these are people you trust with your life. And so then therefore you're going to trust them to go speak for you at these assemblies. You're going to see there's a military and political relationship that's very closely linked. You had to be in the military to get up in the upper echelons of the Senate, to even join the Senate, excuse me. Citizenship, this is very important too. If I was in a class, I'd probably talk about this for 10 minutes. I won't here, but we can talk about it if you guys ask me questions about this next discussion next week. Citizenship, civic identity, not ethnic. For Romans, as I said before, the Romans were a bunch of eclectic tribes that came together, maybe refugees, maybe pirates, maybe cattle thieves, a little bit of everything, a lot of men from different places. And so choosing ethnic identity wasn't going to hold them together. They had to have an identity based on their city, Rome and others, okay? So this citizenship will come before your ethnic group. And when they become an empire, the same will be true. If you're a citizen of the city of Rome, you were a citizen of the whole empire, basically. You didn't even have to see Rome, but you were afforded the same rights and privileges if you had citizenship. This citizenship could be earned. Later on, you could buy it. So it's not a jealously guarded thing as the early Greek city-states. This is kind of a good thing, though, because if you want to hold a larger kingdom or empire together, it's going to be multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-linguistic, and you can't have hyper-nationalism or hyper-ethnic, push if you've got a bunch of different groups that you want them all to get along. So you have civic identity, and you obviously need the rule of law and the protection of private property for that to work. The social contract, basically. This is what we're supposed to have and do have, but there's a lot of people that attack this civic identity. Americans come from every ethnicity on earth, yet we all identify with that American civic identity, hopefully first. Not that it erases your ethnicity, it's just you're supposed to be part of that super tribe, if you will, of American before you're any other thing. All right, so colonies inside Italy. So these Latin tribes are going to move out and eventually start conquering their neighbors. And so they colonize Italy. It takes them a few centuries to colonize all of the Italian peninsula. And as they take over, they don't just crush these people, destroy them, they'll fight them and they'll say, hey, surrender and join us. You can join us as friends, socii et amici, friends and allies of the Roman people. And eventually they'll go through stages of citizenship, all right? This will take a few centuries and this will be an assimilation period. But the Romans become very good at diplomacy. Throughout the centuries, they're very good at diplomacy, and they know when not to push too hard, but they also know when maybe they need to crush someone after they've had to fight them 3 or 4 times, and then they will crush them. But if somebody surrenders, they're allowed to join the tribe, so to speak. All right. Here's the structure of the government here. It's probably better on this slide, unless this was a face-to-face class. It's kind of small. So here we go. This is how it works as far as how you'd work your way through these political offices. This is called the cursus honorum, the sequence of offices. And so one would have had to serve 10 years of military service is basically an aide, secretary, oftentimes to your uncle or maybe your father, usually to more of an uncle though. And so you're probably 17 to 25 here. After you serve 10 years, you're allowed to enter into this first election. And that's when you become a quaestor. And this would have been some kind of financial administrator in the city. And once you've been this quaestor for 1 year, you're enrolled in the Senate for life, as long as you don't break any of the rules and as long as you had kept up basically your class by your property or value, basically, of money. You had to have a certain amount of money and land to have certain class system. I'll get to that in just a second too. So you start as a quaestor. There will be about 20 of them, and you can come to this around 30 years old. Some people, if they were from some of the old families, they might let them be elected at 28 years old, okay? So you could be a pretty young senator. The next would be the aedile. These guys were a form of judge, but they were also in charge of holding public festivals, fixing the roads and things of that nature. Here's the rub on that though. They had to use their own money to do it. So a lot of guys didn't want to do this. They were very wealthy people, and this kind of showed that wealthy families gave to the community. And this would make you very popular if you had, in charge of the games 1 year, and you gave free bread and free oil and great entertainment to the masses. They would remember you, and they would probably elect you to the praetor the next year, or when you're eligible. And so you would have had 2 of the senatorial rank and 2 of the plebeian rank that were allowed to hold this position every year. And these numbers will fluctuate depending on how big Rome gets. You see these numbers fluctuate. Never more than 2 consuls though. So the praetors and the consuls are important because these are going to be the generals in time of war, okay? The praetor and consul are both the chief judges, the chief lawmakers inside the Senate, and the consuls will be the executives of the Senate, okay? So these are very important positions here. These men, as I said, are also generals, and they will both hold what is called imperium. Imperium is power over life and death over your soldiers in times of war outside of the city, but also everyone else, okay? So there's a type of dictatorship one has when they hold imperium, but it does not roll over into the town. In the town, Roman citizen has more protections against just, the swift justice, if you will. And so the praetors, these guys would, after they serve, all of these are 1-year terms, except just being in the Senate, that's for life. You get 1 year. They guarded very jealously how long somebody had power. They'd never wanted a king again. That was a dirty word to the Romans, was king, was rex. So you get 1 year as the executive. There's 2 of them, and they can veto each other. So a lot of things really couldn't get done unless it really had to get done. You know what I mean? So they had to compromise a lot. When these men would serve out their term, they would often be given a province, and that's when you become a propraetor or a proconsul. This is when you get armies too. And as the republic gets bigger and bigger and bigger and gets more and more and more territory, these guys start to be given terms that are sometimes 3-4 years long, and they're able to go get wealthy. The problem is they kind of like this power, they kind of like getting fame, they like being in control of armies, and this can start to corrupt the system. And we're going to see that as we get closer to the fall of the republic, of course. I didn't really talk about the Fasces. The Fasces, where even the word fascism comes from, is this symbol right here, Fascus. This is the rods and axes, or the sticks and axes. This is the symbol of Imperium. A consul would have 12 of these bodyguards around him, and this is a symbol of his power over life and death. Outside of the city, the axe would be sticking out. Inside of the city, the axe is sticking in, because Roman citizens had more protections. It was really hard to have an execution on a Roman citizen. You'd have had to commit treason or murder, or start a fire in the city at night on purpose for whatever anarchic reasons or whatever. You could get executed for treason there too. So it wasn't a common thing to be executed as a Roman citizen unless you really, really screwed up. Okay, so there's our political offices and how you would move through the system. And things do change. This is relatively stable for a couple hundred years. The army, we need to talk about the army because the army is integral into politics. As I said, you have to serve in the army to be in any of the higher offices. So the army, it evolves out of the Greek phalanx. I don't know if I'd said this before, probably not, because we didn't have a lecture on this. At one point, you have more Greeks living in southern Italy than in Greece. This is even in antiquity. So a lot of people say, oh, the Romans stole everything from the Greeks. No, a lot of the Romans were Greek. So yeah, they borrowed institutions. And as the phalanx is evolving, 30, 40 years after it's evolving in Athens and everywhere else, it's in Rome doing the same thing at the same time. So there's obviously trade and there's sharing of ideas. And so they will use these tactics and techniques. But as they fight different people in different topographies, they're going to learn new tactics from their enemy, and they're going to pick them up, tactics and even weapons. All right. And in the mountains and in the more rocky areas, it just made sense to have smaller units that could move, that could separate and come together more quickly. And so you're going to have the legion evolve, and the legion will evolve out of what would be called the maniples, a handful of men and cohorts and whatnot. So if you look out here, traditional phalanx about 1,000 guys, but it's a big square, and it takes a lot of discipline to keep together. It works much better on a more flat surface, a field, but if you start going up into the hills, it can break up. So then we're going to have this evolve into the legion, and the legion from the top down, you have about 4,000 to 6,000 men in a legion, but they're going to be broken up into squares, and those are the cohorts, 10 cohorts. A cohort is 480 to 600 men, at least on the books. Sometimes they'd be smaller. And so that is broken down further into 6 centuries and 3 maniples. All right. And the century, you would probably recognize the centurion. The centurion will be in charge of this. Technically 100 men, but usually it would be 80 men would be in a century. And a contubernium is your tent unit, your 8-man tent unit. So here's a phalanx. This is more of a Macedonian grand phalanx right here. And then here would be the legion. You see basically a lot of squares. And the upper ranked men were actually in double-sized cohorts. All right. And then you had a small amount of cavalry. Later on, when you get to Caesar Hill, you use a lot of auxiliary cavalry, like Gauls and whatnot, 3,000 or 4,000, 5,000 cavalry sometimes, but they won't be the Roman. Roman cavalry with the army is usually only about 120, maybe 200. And these are upper middle class men, the equestrian rank, the knights, if you will. That's where knights came from. All right. So during some of these wars, as I said, they learned from some of these people's techniques, tactics, whatnot. Here would have been the early Roman phalanx. You see them dressed just like the Greeks, using the same bronze cuirasses, shields, same length of spears. This is when the Gauls came down and smashed, almost destroyed Rome. I mean, they sacked the city of Rome at one point. The Gauls would have lived in Upper Italy at that point. Milan, let's say that was a Gallic city at one point, and slowly the Romans will push the Gauls all the way back into Gaul, proper France, and eventually take them over to Caesar. These guys, they're fighting the Samnites. These guys lived in the hills and mountains, And they're going to be the people that use the smaller squares, the maniples. They also used more javelins, and you're going to see these javelins be taken over by the army. Probably going back to here, you see this javelin right here. This is called a pilum. So it's a 7-foot long javelin. It's not a spear. It's got 4 feet of an ash pole, 3 feet of an iron, spear, if you will. It's quite bendable. It's designed to bend actually and kind of hang up in a person's shield. And so they would throw the shield down, and the person would run up then with either another one of these or a sword and take them out without their shield on. So the army of the late Republic would have looked similar to this, meaning Caesar's armies and the civil wars. They're wearing chainmail. Looks like a linothorax of the Greek period, but instead of being made of either bronze or linen, which would be the linothorax, it's made of chainmail. But you see there's a double cape right here, so your shoulders would have 2 thicknesses of chainmail. They didn't even know until about 1980s for sure that Romans had chainmail, and then through a bunch of discoveries, I think near Hadrian's Wall in England or near Scotland, they found boxes of rusted chainmail, and then through further discoveries and now more and more and more just bits and pieces, they've figured out that the Romans used chainmail for hundreds of years. That was their favorite armor. For a while, they're gonna, I'll get into the evolutions later into the empire, but they're gonna be using chainmail almost all the way to the end. And you see some bronze helmets here. So they're still using bronze helmets, sometimes a bronze skin on the shield, but they're using iron armor through most of this period because, of course, we're in the Iron Age from, starting at 1000 BC on up. No one knows for sure who invented chainmail. It might have come from the Hittites or the Mitannians, basically upper Syrian mountain peoples. It could have come from the Gauls. The Gauls are some of the first to make these out of iron, the helmets, I mean, and they were making chainmail as well. The Gauls were awesome iron workers, as were the Etruscans. I didn't get into that. The Etruscans were really good iron workers as well. So this is a kind of a transfer period here. You still got some bronze and some iron. And you see here, this tactic right here, you would have, 4,000 to 6,000 men carrying 2 javelins, the pilum, and so they would throw both of these off. So you'd have anywhere from, maybe 8,000 to 12,000 javelins flying into the air, softening up the enemy. And then these guys would march in very calmly with their very short sword, their gladius. This will be a sword that they adopt from Spanish, from Celtiberians, okay? Their earlier sword might have been a little bit longer. It starts to become more uniform towards the end of the Republic. There's 2 or 3 types, but they're pretty short. They're about 2 feet long. About, I probably have one around here. Maybe next, I'll show you one next time. I want to get up right now. I'm going to forget. All right. So some of the political evolution of what's going on here. We've got the struggle of orders. This happens, in every culture. You're gonna have different classes fighting. There's class antagonism. Wow. Struggles between the different classes. So I should talk about, we have 3 main classes: the patricians, these are the senatorial class, the equestrians, and the plebeians. The patrician class, I believe, I'm trying to remember now, probably needed 200 or 300 sesterce value on the books to maintain their patrician class, and have someone in their family be elected senator, once, maybe consul once, and then this gives them this patrician class. Okay, so they're the aristocrats, not necessarily the richest guys in town, but aristocratic. Okay, they are rich though. They have land. A lot of them have land outside. The merchant class, though, which could be some of the more wealthy people, will be the equestrian class. These men needed to have about 80,000 sesterces. This is a bronze coin. Okay, worth of property or whatever. These guys, the equestrians, they're the horsemen. They're the guy that can afford armor and horses and be in the early legions when you had to buy your own armor. Later on, it will become professionalized and the state will buy armor and weapons for you. But that's part of this rank here. You had to be able to afford a horse and maintain a horse or horses. And a lot of these men would have owned land. And I said they're the business class people. You could move up through the ranks. A lot of patricians came from the equestrian and even the plebeian class. You could also go down in rank too. That's the beauty and horrors of a class system. You can go up and down. And then you've got the plebeians, okay? These are the common folk. These are the citizens, though. There were non-citizen subjects that would live in Rome, And so the plebeians do have rights and privileges that non-citizens don't. These men would, get a trial by jury. They get to vote for the lower assemblies, and they do have to fight in war. The early republic, only the Roman citizens could be in the army. Later on, non-citizens could join the army and earn citizenship. Take you like 20 years though. All right, so the struggle of orders happens. It's kind of a funny tale, but the patricians get in a fight with these other guys, mostly the plebeians, and they're not giving them as many positions in the Senate anymore, which sometimes you'd get a plebeian elected into the Senate. They're not basically sharing power. So the plebeians like, well, we don't need you either. And so, well, you need us more than we need you because we're your farmers. We grow the food, we do all the work. So they just left Rome and they started building a city on the next hill over. And the patricians had to basically beg for them, come back. What do you want? Let's have a little bit more power sharing. Okay. So this is when you get a written constitution in the early stage of this. So now we know what the law is. This is happening around the same time as it's happening in Greece. The first written constitution there is probably 600s, 500s BC. Written constitutions are checks on arbitrary power, because now you know what the law is, and it's harder to change it. The plebs are also given a tribune of the plebs. This guy, these people, 12 of these men are able to veto. These guys can veto consuls and praetors. The problem is these guys can also get bribed. Not supposed to, of course. Towards the end of the Republic, generals, consuls, and praetors start to get in too close with tribunes of the plebs, and problems start to happen. We'll see that as we get closer with, like, say, Mark Antony and Caesar. Mark Antony was a tribune of the plebs, and Caesar, of course, was a general, a consul, a proconsul, and they were working together behind the scenes and then openly, and they weren't the only ones doing that. All right, so the Senate and the people of Rome, this whole idea, SPQR, Senatus Populosque Romanum. So this kind of shows that we're all together now, all right? So you've got the Senate elite, but then the people, and it's not just the people, it's the people's quorum. But the whole thing, the Republic, is the people's thing, the people's business. They own the Republic, all right? So we all have a vested interest to keep it going because we own it. Every citizen owns the Republic. Or how much I'm going to get into this before I do part 2, because I've got to go to UCF today too. All right, Roman religion. This is very important here because Roman religion, they've got their ancient religions. It's going to evolve into maybe what you might recognize of the Greco-Roman era, right, with the gods. Originally, they would have been animistic, just like everybody else. They would have, worshipped spirits, earth, air, fire, water, but also ancestor worship. That's very important to many cultures. If you want to look at that today, you can look at most Asian cultures. The Japanese still use ancestor worship, and to the Romans, this is carried on all the way even into the empire. And sometimes that's more important than even the gods. The gods are important, but worshiping your ancestors, especially the more famous ones, was always important. And so this is going to tie into their whole religious system here, Mos Maiorum, the customs and traditions of the elders of the past. There are two types of Roman law. There are moral laws and there is regular justice. Okay, they're together at first, and later on they'll be separate, which means there'll be priests and then judges take over the more secular law eventually. All right, that's how lawyers come about too, because you used to have to go to a priest to have some kind of justice done. And then they will secularize it more as you get to the mid to late Republic. All right, so you have this idea of, morals or traditions and customs. So you have piety and dignity to the family. The individual is important in Rome, but your family is important too. You can't be anything without your family. You couldn't get politically elected without your family. And the family's not just the nuclear family, just not mom and dad. It's everybody. It's aunt, uncle, grandpa, cousins, everything. And in this, there would be what we call the pater familias, the head of the family. And this isn't just your dad. Your uncle might be the most powerful guy in the family, and he is the pater familias, and he has power over you. You might be his nephew, okay? And then you have a mater familias, the mother of the family, and this might be the pater familias's wife, or maybe it might be his sister. Okay. And so the family had a lot of control, especially over their kids, what kind of jobs you did, who you get married to, what political office you're going to try to run for. And so you had to be part of the family. And this is every class. You know, the poorer class people still had this institution. They might have worked on a farm with, 20 or 30 relatives, but they watched and checked each other all the time. This is where Latins get that very large family structure. And you have to basically go along with it. The family can punish the members within. The paterfamilias, as I told you, has power over life and death. This might not be your dad, it might be your uncle. So if you transgressed horrible, I guess you could be punished or even killed. It's on a rare occasion that would happen, but Roman fathers did that power over their kids. So ancestor worship, this will be folded later into the rise of the Catholic Church happens, saints. That's where saints come from. It is ancient Roman ancestor worship. Instead of worshiping your direct ancestor, you'll be worshiping, an important saint to like a village or a region, okay? There are many different priestly colleges in Rome. Almost every important man was a priest at some time of his life and maybe even held it for life. And then there would be chiefs of each college. And there's the Pontifex Maximus. He's the chief priest of all the priestly colleges. And the Pontifex Maximus is the oldest title, continuous religious title on earth. It's probably around 3,000 years old. The Etruscans used it. The Romans use it. And then, of course, the Romans at one point will hand it over to the Catholic Church. The Pontifex Maximus today is the Pope, okay? Obviously not a pagan, but he's still has this ancient title. And the Catholic Church, when we get there, you're going to see borrow a lot of titles and a lot of the institution structures of the Roman state. All right. I'll spend a few more minutes and I'll probably end. Yeah, we get down to maybe this one here. All right. So Rome starts to expand outside of Italy. Rome is going to be a reluctant empire. And I mean the Republic. The Republic already starts to become an empire before they really even know what that means. They're going to invent the word in empire from imperium, power over others. Okay. And they even then have an issue with like whether it's right, the ethics of it. Like, I mean, it causes problems to be an empire, and they knew it. They discussed it already. So here's how it starts. The Punic Wars. There's 3 Punic Wars. The Romans are dragged into war with the Carthaginians. It's sometimes better to look at a map here. So here's Carthage. The Carthaginians had a pretty vast empire. These are a Phoenician empire, and these are the most powerful merchants, and they have the most powerful navy of the day. You see, they own part of Sicily, and this is what's going to drag Rome into war with them. They're going to go into war with some Greek mercenaries, I think the Sons of Mars or something, and those guys are going to drag the Romans into this like through a proxy war, and it's going to spill over into almost like their version of a global war, world war. And it's a pretty massive war. Each of these wars last, at least the first 2 will last 20 years each, okay? And you're going to see after Rome wins the first one, it's largely a naval war. They're going to have to learn how to have a navy. They don't have a navy. They have to steal some ships from these Carthaginians and reverse engineer them and make their own navy. They turn their navy ships into infantry platforms and start to grab onto ships and bring Marines over. The Marines are born, if you will, with the Romans. And so when they win this, they're going to start accruing land. And so you see they take Sicily, Sardinia, and parts here getting into Spain, parts of Gaul. And so this is the Romans' first bit of empire. And they're still like, what should we do with this? They have to start sending out governors. These governors have control over armies. These governors don't have a colleague to check them, so they can get into trouble. They can be corrupt. And so things already start happening that makes them a bit nervous. So anyways, there's going to be another war. And by that time, you see they're going to take over the rest of Spain, at least the bottom part, and start to move into and annex Asia Minor. All right. And that's part of some other wars with the Seleucids and whatnot. And then the third war, they just go and destroy Carthage. That's not much of a war. It's like a mop-up operation. And so you see here by the mid to late Republic or late Republic, you see a small empire. It's not too small. It's getting pretty big. And they're starting to take over large parts of the Mediterranean. And this is going to bring them into conflict with other people soon. But as I said, they're a reluctant empire because a lot of what they do in Asia Minor is set up client kings, not actually puppet kings. These are friends and allies of Roman people, but they'll be brought into Asia Minor 3 or 4 times through defending their interests there. And finally, they annex Asia Minor, and eventually they'll annex Syria to basically stave off a new empire from Persia coming in, the Parthians. All right. That would have been part of the Mithridatic Wars. There are 3 Mithridatic Wars that will drag Rome into Asia Minor. And basically, King Mithridates, he claims he is the descendant of Alexander the Great and Darius both. So he's Greco-Persian, and he is an awesome warrior. This guy's in his late 60s and I think 70s maybe, and he's still out in battle, like wasting people. Okay, and it takes 3 or 4 of Rome's best generals to defeat this guy over a series of couple decades. Finally, if they defeat him, they don't even kill him. He ends up killing himself or having himself killed. He didn't want to get captured. And that is when the Romans will annex the territory, because he was already making deals with Parthia, the Persian Empire. Armenia was also making deals with the Parthian Empire. So the Romans go in there and annex Syria as well. So at this point in the 60s BC, this territory will be annexed. Yeah, I think they leave Armenia as a client kingdom, as a buffer state against Parthia. So by the time of the first century BC here, you've got, this will be really after Augustus takes full control here, but you're going to see the Mediterranean come under full control of Rome, even in the BC period. Probably 30 BC, this will be the case. No empire before, no other empire after will ever control the entire Mediterranean. That's crazy. We can talk about that in the discussion. You guys can ask questions about that. Used to be a lot of piracy here. Well, they had to nip that in the bud 3 or 4 times. All right, I got to go pretty soon. So you know what? I think I'll start here next time, because then we'll get down to here. Yeah, so I'll remind myself, I'll leave a note to start with the consequences of empire, like what happens when you go from a kingdom or this republic into an empire and start bringing in a bunch of new people, including millions of slaves. Okay, we'll talk about the consequences. All right. So I'll pick up there next time.